lead us in worship, ladies. Let's look at the book of Genesis, the very last chapter toward the very last words of that book. Genesis chapter 50, bringing to the close that great book, the first book of what we call the Pentateuch. That means the 5 scrolls. That's what the Hebrews referred to this as. And so we'll look at chapter 50, and I'll just focus here on verse 20. We'll look at the passage, and then we'll look at the background of it. Verse 20 says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." You know, those words take place in a context that is similar, unfortunately, to probably what everybody in this room has experienced. And that is, they had just returned from the funeral of a loved one. That long, eventful life of Jacob has come to an end, the last of those patriarchs, and there's family members who now should be, and we would expect them to be, experiencing excessive grief. One of them was, and that was Joseph, and the others should have been, but there was a reason they weren't. They could not begin to deal with that grief process because their emotions had been completely eclipsed by another emotion, okay? That emotion of grief could not manifest itself because they were overwhelmed with another emotion. Because what emotion could they have been experiencing that would have been so overwhelming that they could not even focus on this grief process? Well, it was fear. These folks were afraid. They were afraid for their lives. These brothers of Joseph were afraid for the lives of their families. Because, you see, many years ago, they had sold Joseph into slavery. You know the story. He was sold into slavery going into Egypt. He had many kinds of trials and tribulations that he went through. Okay? God was faithful to him through every bit of it, and gave him a place of very high regard and service and power in the Egyptian government. And when a famine came, and there was no food for his brothers who were still in Israel, they came to Egypt looking for food. And again, you know the story. They found the one who was responsible for all the storehouses of food was none other than Joseph himself. And so, of course, they were overcome with fear then. What's he going to do? He's going to pay us back for what we did. And this same fear is overtaking them years later. You said, well, wait a minute. Didn't he tell them not to worry about this years ago? Yes. If you go back and read chapter 45 of the book of Genesis, do you not find in there where they had this very discussion, and he told them not to fear? You know, that he would take care of them. Everything was going to be okay. Yeah, he told them, well, why are they afraid? Folks, they're afraid because they never did fully believe Joseph when he said that. They thought the reason he is being outwardly kind to us is Daddy is still alive. And he does not want to bring any other hardship on Daddy. Now that Daddy is dead, he is going to vent his anger on us. There is no telling what is going to happen. And that's why you understand they really couldn't focus on their grief because they were so afraid of what was going to happen to them. And at this place, Joseph makes 2 statements. Folks, in that, actually one of them is in verse 20, but I'll go back up and read verse 19 as well, because Jacob makes 2 absolutely remarkable statements here. And when I ran back across the one in verse 19, I thought, you know, I need to preach an entire sermon on that. And notice what it says there. Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. And listen, he makes a statement in the form of a question. This is what you call a rhetorical question. That's a question that you're not really looking for an answer for. It's for rhetorical purposes. And so he asks a question. For am I in the place of God? They were scared to death. What are you going to do? What kind of vengeance are you going to pour out? And he asked the question, folks, am I in the place of God? Because you know, every problem that we are facing in humanity today goes back to that issue. We're not allowing God to be God. We want to put in some way ourselves in the place of God. Now you just think through that. What kinds of problems that results in. For instance, the scripture says, God's own quote, vengeance is mine, I will repay. You don't worry about that. And that's precisely what Joseph was saying. Am I in the place of God? That's not my place. I just do what God has put me here to do, and I let him be God. It's not my place to do that. You folks have nothing to worry about. But what I'm focusing on is what he says in verse 20. Okay. He says, all of this that happened, let's not put, sweep any of it under the carpet. All of this really did happen. And you're going to have to face it, he's saying to his brothers. You meant it for evil. You wanted me destroyed. And then there's that great word, that little word that appears so many times in the scripture that is so important. But. You meant it for evil, but, folks, listen, God always has the last word. Okay? You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And what good was God working? He says there, it's to save this people alive. It was to save our whole family. God had a purpose of sending me down here, and that was to save the lives of our entire family. You say, folks, what's that to us today? Why does that matter to us? Because that was the family through whom God had promised to send his Messiah. And if something would have happened to them, God's plan would have come to naught. God's plan never comes to naught. God never fails. He never has a plan B. He doesn't need a plan B. And he was working out the events of history in the lives of these people to save that family. And it happened by these people doing something evil that God meant for the good. And so I want us to point out here. First of all, folks, the first thing I want you to see is that evil comes to us from a variety of sources. The second thing I want you to see is that God can make good come out of evil. And the third thing I want you to see is oftentimes God uses us to help him bring good out of evil. We're not always bystanders who are just watching. And so the first thing I want to focus on that we see in our text is that evil comes to us from a variety of sources. Now, I didn't get an amen there, but I figured that everybody here would say you probably don't need to spend a lot of time on that because every one of us knows that. Evil comes to us from a variety of sources. Folks, in this text, what we see is that sometimes evil comes to us at the hands of other people. Other people can actually do things that negatively affect us. You know, when that happens, I have a tendency to want to say to God, that just doesn't sound fair. You know, I can be minding my own business and doing my own thing, and somebody can do something, and you've arranged the world, God, in such a way that what they do can wreak havoc on my life. It can create something evil in me, and that doesn't seem right. But you know what I also found out about myself is a lot of times, most of the time, people are not doing something evil for me. They're doing something that actually helps me. And I noticed at times like that, I don't complain that God made the universe the way he did so that other people could affect me in that way. It's only when they're doing something evil. Okay? But it works both ways. God has created the universe in such a way that things that people do can be very beneficial to us. But the problem is, in this case, it was not. Okay? This happens. Joseph's minding his own business for the most part, and he is sold into slavery. What happens in our lives that is oftentimes evil is brought about by other people. You say, well, who are the people? Well, folks, I really want to point out to you the first person here was his father. You say, wait a minute here. His father did not sell him into slavery. In fact, he would have never done that. That is true. But folks, here's the problem. A lot of times when we go to cast blame or find fault where it actually is, sometimes we fail to fully appreciate the circumstances that gave rise to that evil deed. Sometimes it's the context that allows for this. And that's precisely what happened with his father. His father created an atmosphere that was conducive for something like this to happen. And that is because he showed favoritism to this son. Now, it is probably the case that we can look at our children, we can look at our grandchildren, and we can see maybe some of them are more intelligent than others, better personality than others in our minds, and we may not be able to prevent ourselves from saying, well, we have our highest hopes set on that. That may be. But friends, what we must never do, and what is a recipe for disaster in every case, is to show favoritism one over the other. And that's what happened. And again, you know the story. It reached its peak when Joseph shows up with this beautiful coat. Now, most of us aren't aware. We just say, he got a pretty coat and they didn't get one. That was not the point here, okay? Folks, the coat that he was wearing was not that just he had a nice coat that they didn't get. That coat was representative of headship, of chieftain. It was the father's way of saying to everybody, this is the one whom our hopes are ultimately placed on. This is the one who has preeminence. Well, folks, you know enough about Hebrew thought and life. That went to the oldest son. Okay? And so when he shows up with this coat, it's not, again, just he got a coat and they didn't. It was the father, again, showing favoritism to a son that he should have never shown favoritism to. And so there's a sense in which this was his father's fault. If his father hadn't have done this, this whole scenario would have never been possible. But also notice, you say, wait a minute, but what about the brothers? Well, obviously they're the ones who sold him into slavery. Okay? It's that they cannot use the excuse, folks, that a lot of times we want to use, well, Daddy made us mad. Because listen, nobody makes you mad. Okay, that means they're controlling you. Okay? People don't make you mad. They do something and you choose to get mad. Okay? That's a way we have of removing ourselves from responsibility. Well, he made me mad. No, he didn't make you anything. Okay? That person did something and you made a choice. And that's where we bear our responsibility. But they did do something here. They're the ones that actually sold him into slavery. Now, why did they do that? You say, well, if it wasn't just the father's fault, he creates the circumstances. Folks, well, the problem is they allowed bitterness to grow in their heart rather than deal with the bitterness. It grew to become even hatred, this resentment that is built up. And it was, now what should they have done? Folks, they should have called Joseph in and said, Joseph, listen, you're the youngest of the brothers. In some ways, you're less mature. We need to have a talk. Let me tell you what you're doing. It's creating problems in the family, and we're all one. Folks, they didn't do any of that. They just allowed the bitterness and resentment to turn completely into hatred, and then that leads them to do something that many years later, and maybe almost immediately, they were sorry for. So it was his father's fault. It was his brother's fault. Okay? They're the ones that did it. But folks, I want you to notice something else here. There was somebody else at fault here. And that was Joseph himself. You say, well, what did he do? Well, instead of playing the role of a humble younger brother, he did exactly the opposite. He seems to have capitalized on what his father was doing. You remember he had dreams, in which he went and told his brothers his dreams. We were all working. We had shocks of wheat or corn, or wheat or whatever it was, and yours came and bowed down to mine. What was the purpose? Folks, I don't know. Somebody else can decide whether or not you can help what you dream. I don't know if you can or not, but I'll tell you what. You can help who you tell it to, okay? And he seemed to thrive on lording it over his brothers. Okay? And so we look, and so you know what that tells us, folks, that we don't want to face? When something evil happens to us, now it's certainly not always. Okay? But look, we want to say that, look what somebody else did. Look what these people did to bring us back. And a lot of times, many times, not always, when we want to find part of the problem, we need to look in the mirror. Sometimes the problem is us. We've met the enemy and it's us. We're the ones that he actually was partly responsible for bringing this about. He, in some degree, brought this on himself, just like at times we bring evil things on ourselves. But sometimes it's in the form of bad health. Now certainly not all times. But my health isn't good. Well, what did you do to take care of your health? And we look at all kinds of things and we say, well, we didn't do it. Well, then it's partly our fault. But we just don't want to hear that part of it. Okay? I had a lady that came to me one time, a member of the church, and she said, preacher, I need to talk to you. And I said, okay. So she came by the office and she said, nobody in the church likes me. Well, folks, if nobody in the church likes you, I promise you, you do not have to tell the pastor that. Okay? He already knows it. Okay? Okay. And she started telling me that people didn't like her, and I had to sit and listen to it while I was wanting to say, and maybe I should have you ever stopped and thought why it might be that they don't like you? Is it because you're running your mouth all the time? Okay. Is it because you're backbiting? Is it because your view is that as long as this is a Baptist church, we're never going to completely agree on anything? I'll always disagree. Maybe it's her own fault. And indeed, it was. And so as we look at what is happening around our lives, folks, evil can come to us from a lot of sources. But let's don't overlook this, folks, or we miss the whole point. When evil comes upon us, it can be other people. Okay? It can be ourselves. But let me tell you something else. It's always Satan. It's always Satan. Okay? Regardless of what form it takes. when evil things happen, it's always going to be Satan. If you look in the book of Job, you look in that first chapter, folks, that is a great chapter that tells us so many things. I want you to see here how the problems that Job was facing came in a lot of forms, but this text tells us who was behind it all. Okay? In verse 7 of Job 1, the Lord said to Satan, where'd you come from? Where you been? Satan says, I'm from going to and fro on the earth, walking up and down it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him on the earth. He is a blameless, upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, well, does he fear you for no reason? I mean, isn't it because you've put a hedge of protection around him and around his house and on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands and his possessions. You've increased his land. But he says to God, now, if you stretch out your hand and touch everything he has, he'll curse you to his face. Now, folks, here's what you say. The Lord said to Satan, behold, everything that he has is in your hands. I'll turn him over to you to a point. Okay? I'll let you do whatever you want to. Now, folks, what I want you to see here is all these issues that, Job in almost one fell swoop lost about everything. Part of it was weather. Part of it was marauders who came in and swept through it, lost his family. And the question is, Job only saw what was happening. He didn't see what was behind it, which I'm trying to get us to see right now. Every time there's evil, there's something behind it. And it's a spiritual world that is behind what everything is happening here. And that's what happened. Job didn't see that. Oftentimes we don't see it. When the evil comes our way, and here's why we lose the battles, folks. We fail to understand who the ultimate enemy is. when these evil things happen at the hands of other people, or even sometimes ourselves, we look simply for a final explanation in the space-time temporal world that we're living in. And the Bible keeps telling us, no, look beyond that. We wrestle not with flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers. And the reason we lose the battle so many times is we don't see that it's grounded in a spiritual issue. A spiritual that's handled for the most part by prayer and dependence upon the Lord. And so it's vital that we see that. So what do we see here first, folks? The thing that all of us know. Evil comes to us from a variety of areas, from many angles. Now, you're probably saying, I hope this gets better, because if you were supposed to be encouraging us, you have not encouraged us. You just told us we can get hit from every side with evil. And that is true. If I communicated that to you, that is exactly what I wanted to communicate. And who is behind it? Ultimately, Satan. But folks, a lot of times before you can get encouragement, you have to get the discouragement. So you got the discouragement. Now here's the encouragement in this text here. Even though evil can come to us from a variety of sources, God can bring good out of evil. God can bring good out of evil. Okay? In fact, we even see in this case with Job, the initial evil that comes to us has to come at least permitted by the hand of God. Friends, listen. You see that passage I read? It said, Satan said, your servant Job, you got a hedge around him. Nothing can get to him. Now, folks, here's the good news. God's got a hedge around all his children. He's built a hedge around every one of his children. There is absolutely nothing that comes to you that was not God letting the hedge down and allowing that to be. God is not in the heavens twiddling his thumbs, wondering what's going on and what kind of problem you're going to be confronted with next. Okay? God is fully aware and God is fully in control. So, yes, it is true. Before this could even happen to Job, it had to come through the hand of the Lord. And listen, Job realized that. If you go down to chapter, in that same chapter, look at verse 21, after he had lost all these things, it says he worshiped God. And he said this, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I'm going to return. I didn't bring anything in, I'm not going to take anything out. And then he said, the Lord gave, and the Lord took away. You say, well, wait a minute, I thought Satan took away. He did. But he couldn't do it without entering through that hedge that God had placed around his child. And so, God can make good come out of evil. He can even prevent any evil, but my friends, listen, when he allows it, he's always going to bring something good out of it. God does not allow evil to happen. That he is not going to... Now that doesn't mean, and I'm going to say, it doesn't mean you're always going to see it. Okay? God's got an eternity to work this thing out, okay? Not our little sliver of space and time we live in. Okay? Sometimes we can see it, and sometimes we don't. In Joseph's case, they did see it. Okay? Now, so it doesn't mean, folks, listen, when God brings good out of evil, as I said, that doesn't mean we always see it, and it doesn't mean that we fully understand God's plan. All of this time, this was going on with Joseph. Joseph wasn't saying, I know what God's doing. He's using me here to save everybody alive. He had no clue what God was doing. But he trusted God anyway. Friends, we may not understand what God's doing, but let me assure you, God understands what God's doing. And God has shown us time and time again, he can be trusted in what he is doing. Folks, sometimes what we look out and see in our lives, in our community, in our world is absolute chaos. And I'll tell you, God doesn't see it that way. Okay? God is saying, I've got this. I've got this. I remember shortly after my wife and I got married, I came home. I was in the graduate school, University of South Carolina at the time. I came home. she was at work. I got home earlier. We'd gotten a package in the mail. And I figured, well, we just got married. It's probably another wedding gift. And it was. It was from some cousin of hers in Kansas that I'd never met. And so I opened it, and it was this piece of cloth, and it was the ugliest thing I've ever seen in my life. I don't know what it was. I said, there's these strings all over the place. I thought, what in the world did we ever do to her? You know? And so Deanna came home. I said, look what your cousin sent us. And she looked at it. I said, isn't that the ugliest thing you've ever seen? And she said, well, yeah, unless you turn it over this way and look at it from this side. And it was one of these needlepoint things. I thought, oh, I knew that. Okay. Well, it looked completely different on one side than it did on the other side. Okay? And the problem is, with our limited knowledge, when we are looking at what God's doing, we're looking at the underside. And a lot of times it looks ugly. And a lot of times it looks meaningless. And a lot of times it leads us to ask what I asked, what have we done to deserve this? And God is saying, if you only knew. And folks, sometimes we will know, and sometimes we won't. But every time we can actually trust God. You can see this in Joseph's instance. Again, he didn't know how all of this was going to turn out. You know, we get to read the rest of the story and read it back and say, don't worry, Joseph. Well, that wasn't where he was. He was having to experience all this misunderstanding. You know, he was sold into slavery. He thought, what did I do? I don't deserve this. He was falsely accused by the wife of the one whom he had been ultimately sold to. That was unfair. He gets thrown into prison. That's an unfair prison term. And he's supposed to get out. When his friend gets out, he's supposed to tell anybody. He forgets to tell, and so he's still stuck. And it's like, God, where are you? Now, friends, let me be honest with you, and you be honest with me. Have you ever been at that place in your life when you said, God, where in the world are you? Where are you? Well, that's exactly where he was. Where are you? But we're going to see in a moment how he responded to this. You know, God continued to work in his circumstance and brought him again to be a leader in Egypt, to be in a place of authority where he could save the lives of his entire family. Because everything he went through, he had gone through it for a reason, even though he didn't see what that reason was. Friends, God is always in your life and mine, and in the world in which we're living. God is always bringing good out of evil. Now, again, let me say this. Sometimes it's immediate. Sometimes we see it. Sometimes we don't. But let me say again, God's plan is not limited to that little sliver of space and time in which you live and I live. God has got an eternity to make good come out of evil. And he is in the process of doing that. And I have good news for you. He will win. He will have the last say. And that's true in my life and yours. Because a lot of times we fail to see in our lives what God's actually doing. Folks, we may sometimes see God doing one or two things in our lives, and he's doing 100 things. We may see where he brings one thing into our life. We say, well, he's going to bring one thing out of that. Friends, God may be doing 1,000 things by doing one specific thing that he's done. And the fact is, he just trusted him. Folks, the greatest example of this, the greatest example of God bringing good out of evil. Folks, the worst thing that ever happened, the greatest act of injustice that there has ever been in the annals of human history was the crucifixion of the Lord of heaven, the perfect, immaculate one, treated as a common criminal and placed on a cross and died that kind of death. That is the worst thing that ever happened in all of human history. No wonder the sun wouldn't shine. No wonder it went dark. I wouldn't have looked on it either. Now, that's the most evil thing that ever happened. Now, let me ask you another question. What's the best thing that ever happened in the entire universe? It was Jesus dying on the cross to save us from our sins. Folks, it was the same thing. You see what God did? And he had a bunch of reasons for doing it. He actually took the worst thing, the greatest act of evil that had ever been perpetrated, and made it be the best act that had ever been perpetrated. Friends, God's in the business of doing that. And let me promise you this, and I'll promise it based on God, not me. My words don't mean anything. If God can take the worst thing in the world that ever happened and make it be the best thing in the happen, I'll promise you, he can handle anything in between that's happened in your life and mine. He has no problem with it. God takes bad things and makes good things to come from those. Because we can see it in our own lives at times. I mean, I could reiterate instances in my life where something happened and I thought, again, Lord, where in the world are you? This is plain as day. This is wrong. I know that, and I don't know nearly as much as you do. Anybody can see this is not right. This is unfair. This is unjust. And I look back years later and I think, oh, mercy. Oops. Lord, sorry I ever said anything. You know what happened? I just had to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord in that situation. That's what it was. Now, folks, let me also say this. There are things that I look back on in my life, and I also say of those things, those aren't right. That doesn't seem right. Lord, what in the world are you doing? And he still hadn't showed me. You know what that means? It just means he still hadn't showed me. It doesn't mean that he's not working good out of those. You see, God gives us insights into these situations like Joseph, like those in our own lives, where we do see, where we come back and say, Lord, you knew best all the time, to where, folks, we can have enough faith to say, Lord, if we can actually trust you in the times that we can now see, that tells us we ought to be able to trust you in those times we can't see. Folks, the same God is in the darkness and in the light. The same God who can be trusted when you can see is the same God that can be trusted when you can't see. And the text is very clear about that. Now, a third thing I want you to say. Evil comes to us from a variety of sources. God is in the process of bringing good out of evil things. Why don't you see a third thing is, folks, many times God gives us the privilege of working with him to bring good out of evil. Now, he doesn't do that every time. Sometimes he just acts unilaterally. Like I mentioned in the cross of Christ, God did that. There was nobody helping God along, lovingly serving. Now, these people were helping God without realizing it. They were fulfilling God's plan without knowing it when they were crucifying Jesus. Okay? But friends, in the cross of Christ, God just unilaterally said, hey, sit still. Watch. I'm going to take the worst thing that ever happened and make it the best thing that ever happened, and you don't even have to agree with it, like it, or be involved in it. Because there's a lot of things God does. He doesn't do unless we have faith to believe. Folks, there's other things that God's going to do whether you have faith or not. We need to read and determine which of the... God says all things work together for the good of those who love the Lord. He didn't say if you have faith that he does. He said he's going to do that anyway. You either believe him and have the joy of seeing it and believing it or not. Okay? But he's going to do that anyway. God is going to work all things together for the good of those who love him, and he's going to do it unilaterally if he has to, all on his own. But you know what's beautiful? Is sometimes God uses us and lets us actually play a role in taking something evil and bringing something good out of it. But folks, it all starts with our attitude toward it. How do we choose to deal with what happens in our lives? Because many people want to go back and put an overemphasis on the circumstances. Well, I'm in this situation because of this circumstance. And folks, sometimes you are. But there's a phrase I think that people a lot of times use that I think maybe Christians not all use. And that is, people say, well, how are you doing? Well, under the circumstances. Now, folks, I've said it before. I know, I've said that myself. But when somebody says that, I want to say, stop right there. Let me ask you a question. What are you doing under the circumstances to begin with? You know what God wants you to do? He wants you to ride the waves of the circumstances. You see, the proof that circumstances do not determine us is you can put two people in exactly the same circumstances, and one of them responds one way and one of them responds another. You know what the difference is? It's the choices that we choose to make. I don't know much about sailing. I've never been on a sailboat. I've been on boats of different kinds. I've never been on a sailboat. But what I'm told about a sailboat, if a person who's a true sailor knows what they're doing, is even if the wind is blowing them in a contrary direction, they know how to adjust the sails to use that to their advantage by adjusting the sails. Folks, we can't help in our lives many times how the wind's blowing. We can't determine what's happening in our lives, but I'll tell you what we can do. We can adjust our sails. We can adjust our lives and our attitudes and our actions to bring about the best results in the midst of those circumstances. And that's exactly what Joseph did. I want you to notice what he did not do. In the midst of all of this, he did not turn his back on God. He actually cooperated with God through the whole process. He doesn't turn his back on God. Because you know that's what some people do. They claim to be Christians. And soon as something happens in their lives, and folks, I'm agreeing, evil things happen. I'm not minimizing that. I understand that. But when something evil happens in their lives, then they turn their back on God. And how does this possibly happen? Well, I've heard say, well, I found out when that happened, it just doesn't pay to serve God. Well, folks, we're not supposed to serve God because it pays. We're supposed to serve God because He's worthy of it. In good times and bad times. And you know what? Theoretically, if you talk to these people that turn their back on God, theoretically, they would agree with you. Yeah, you ought to trust God at all times. You know what happens? It's when reality slaps them in the face. Folks, we can have a theology without having it in practice. We can have this worked out of how things ought to be. God ought to be trusted. He can be trusted at good times and bad times, and then when bad times come, they don't trust Him anymore. Because that's where we have to be very careful that our lives are actually brought into conformity with what we actually believe. Okay? He didn't turn his back on God. He continued to trust God even though he said everything that's happening to me seems to be contrary to what God really ought to be wanting. And it's certainly contrary to what I'm wanting. And he still trusted God in the midst of it. So I want you to see the second way that it shows he continued to cooperate with God. He did not seek revenge against his brothers. He didn't seek revenge. In fact, I told you back in chapter 45, he already said, hey, I forgive you. Revenge is God's. Let Him take care of that part of it. He just calls me to forgive. Folks, look, that takes a great amount of faith. For us to say, vengeance is His, let Him repay. It takes faith. Because see, when something happens, the first thing we want to do is say, I'll get it right. I'll pay them back. Folks, you see where the faith has to come in? The faith has to come in, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to have to depend on that God is going to do it. I'm going to have to actually turn this over to God and trust Him that He really is going to take care of it. Folks, that takes a measure of faith, believe you me. When somebody wrongs you, to be able to say, Lord, my hands are off. You know, that it is not my responsibility to get even with them. We hear, folks, and again, you don't hear this. This is contrary to the Bible, but it's popular in our culture. Revenge is sweet. Revenge is sweet. I pay them back. Friends, I'll be honest with you. I've never found that to be true. I found it might be true for a very short amount of time, but I will promise you this. Seeking revenge on somebody for doing you wrong is never going to bring you the peace and happiness and joy that you think it's going to. That's why that statement's not found in the Bible. It's found in our popular culture. Revenge is sweet. God never said that. He said He will be the one to take care of it. And then I want you to notice what He did towards. Not only did He not hold it against His brothers, folks, listen, He forgave them. He forgave them. Said, I'm not actually, now folks, what does that mean? It means, forgiveness always means this. It means absorbing the hurt into ourselves rather than turning it back in anger and resentment and trying to pay somebody back. That's actually what it is, okay? It's absorbing the pain into ourselves. We choose to forgive the person, not reflect the pain in some kind of payback, but actually to absorb it into ourselves. And folks, isn't that exactly what Christ did for us on the cross? Isn't that exactly what he did? Instead of turning that wrath on us, he absorbed that into himself and paid the price. So folks, you know what that says? That says in some degree, and notice it's not the same degree. When you forgive other people, you are being like Jesus. In fact, I think I could truthfully say, you are never any more like Jesus than you are when you forgive somebody that has wronged you. That's what Jesus did. He absorbed the pain into himself instead of turning it back on us. So how do we know that he actually, have you ever wondered how can I actually know if I really forgave somebody? Because our hearts can be deceitful. Lord, I think I did. I think I've forgiven him. You know, Joseph sort of gives us some tests here. Folks, he says to them this, fear not. Fear not. I don't want you to be afraid. I don't want you to live in fear, looking over your shoulder when the time comes, I'm going to get you. Now, I may not even be going to do it, really, but I want you to live in the fear that I'm going to. Folks, if somebody's wronged you and somehow you're hoping, well, I just hope they're living, I'm not going to do anything, you know. But I hope they're scared to death that I'm going to. Well, then you haven't forgiven them. Forgiving them says, fear not. I don't want you to live in fear. The way you know when he got forgiven is when he got into a place of where he had an advantage over them, he didn't use it. He actually used the advantage that he had for their own good. So you may not ever get a chance to do that, but you know what? You can do sort of what I call a thought experiment. You can mentally put yourself in a situation and say, what if this was the situation? And I sort of got to be the supervisor over this person and sort of control them. What would I do? Folks, I'll tell you where our hearts are. And he told us where he did not use his advantage over them, but he used it for them. Because that's a pretty good sign you're forgiven. And I'll tell you what makes it easier. It may not be a sign you've forgiven it, but folks, it does make it easier for him to be able to say exactly what Joseph said here. To be able to say, even if not to them, in your own heart, yeah, you meant it for evil. But it's a whole lot easier for me to deal with it if I know that God's bringing good out of it. Folks, we are never more like God than when we forgive. That's what God does to people who seek forgiveness. That's what he calls us to do, to be truly forgivers. And so I would just ask you, when you look at your own life, is there somebody you haven't forgiven? Is there maybe somebody that you thought you had forgiven, but you haven't? And you need to deal with it. Well, that's why God gives us passages like this, so we can deal with it. You know? Can you begin, and will you begin, maybe even more so right now, to say, God, let me actually look at those things in my life that have happened, that have been evil, and Lord, let me see the good you're bringing out of it. And maybe even a step beyond that, as Joseph did, said, Lord, let me ask you a question. How can I help you bring good out of this evil situation? But again, folks, that's what God did for us in Christ. You know, God, in Christ, absorbed our pain that we were afflicting upon him. Every injustice, every moral failure on our part, he was faithful. And he absorbed it into himself. And you know, he could have never done that. I'm saying God would have done it a different way, but he didn't. The reason Jesus was able to do that is because several hundred years before, Joseph played his role. And he remained to save this people alive so that Messiah would come one day. Friends, you never know the full implications of what God is doing in bringing good out of the evil in your life. Who would have ever thought? Joseph would have never thought, and probably didn't find out till he got to heaven, what all. Not only did you save the lives of these people, but you ensured that God's plan was going to continue to bring the ultimate good, and that is the salvation that comes through Jesus Christ. Let's pray together.